Hey everyone, this is Vince. Welcome to my channel. Here I try to summarize for you ideas or books that I think are important and I think you should know about. I was working on a video on a book by Bart Ehrman, one of his most popular trade books called How Jesus Became God, and I realized as I was doing it that I was given a lot of back information to try and explain how I think you should read Ehrman. Now, I think that's needed, especially since he's become so popular and frankly very divisive to a lot of people. That is, he has his fan base that agrees with him no matter what he says, and that's understandable since most people that are like him, especially those who grew up there raised with very strict evangelical beliefs, and they find him a very refreshing voice, one that's helped them as they try to deconstruct or to deal with those beliefs that they were raised with. On the other side, you have those who absolutely can't stand him because really they were raised with maybe the same beliefs, but then, they grew accustomed to those beliefs, and so they really find Ehrman to be a threat to them. Either way, I think Ehrman is often misread on either side, or at least I think there are things that you should keep in mind when you're trying to read Ehrman that will hopefully let you get the most out of his scholarship. Okay, so here are my 4 things I think you should keep in mind when reading Ehrman. Or Ftitsi Kimri for short. And these are in no particular order. I tried to go from like less important to most important, just so I could say something like, number 4 will shock you. But I couldn't make it flow as well as I wanted to. So here goes in no particular order. Ftitsi Kimri. Number 1, and this one's really just definitional. It makes a distinction that I think that you really can't get Ehrman without knowing, and that is not all Christians are evangelical. So there's this narrative that surrounds Bart, that he grew up as a Christian, and then, after consulting his best friend Satan, he decided that he'd leave his old lifestyle and he'd wage war on all Christians everywhere. That's not true. I mean, at least as far as I know, at least as far as you can prove somebody has not made a deal with Satan, I can't find any proof to that. What is true is that he was raised as an evangelical Christian, and as he began studying, he started to feel like those beliefs that he grew up with were untenable to the things that he was studying. So as he grew as a historian, he followed where he thought the evidence led him, without being forced to hold on to these beliefs that he was raised in. Okay, so I think that like inherent in that is this question of, what do evangelicals believe? That's a really good question. The definition of what constitutes an evangelical has varied widely and has changed over throughout history. When I was growing up, and I also grew up evangelical, the word meant something about biblical inerrancy. Like, regardless of what else you might think is attached to that, an evangelical held that the Bible was inerrant, or it had no mistakes whatsoever. It was inerrant in history, in science, in logical consistency. It was completely without flaw. And if you believe that, then you are well on your way to being an evangelical. Today, the word is starting to morph into a word that means Christian nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, as shown in polls that show that more and more white Christian nationalists are choosing the word evangelical to define themselves, even if they're not actually Christian. What I mean by that is that people of other religions or even atheists will adopt the name evangelical if they hold to the politics of a white Christian nationalist. So it's an interesting development, and one that you can learn about, by the way, from a book that I did summarize on my channel called The Flag and the Cross by 2 sociologists, Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry. But the meaning that I grew up with, the meaning of inerrancy in all things, that's the one that Ehrman really doesn't care for, especially when we talk about reading the Bible as a history book, because Ehrman is a historian. Now, what I wanted to stress with this number 1 things to remember when reading Bart Ehrman is that Bart does not have a problem with Christians. He said many times he does not have any problem with Christians or what Christians believe. He doesn't write anything against Christianity. In fact, Bart's wife is a Christian. So if you are a Christian, there's no reason for you to be afraid of Bart Ehrman. Evangelicals represent a minority of Christians around the world, and that may sound weird because they are certainly the loudest in the United States, and so you start thinking that they represent the majority of Christians, but they don't. And they are just one type of Christian. In fact, I think it's debatable whether they actually deserve to be called Christians, if we're going to define Christian as those that follow Jesus' teachings. And some evangelicals might even appreciate what I'm saying here, because most evangelicals will tell you that the words of Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount or the declaration to love and serve others, all that stuff really doesn't apply to us today. They really only apply to the people that he was talking to at the time. And all of them would say that the words of Jesus hold no more weight as any other person who speaks in the Bible or wrote a book in the Bible. So I think it's definitely arguable that they shouldn't be counted in the same religion as those who do listen to the words of Jesus and seek to follow him. So my big point here is, for Christians, when reading Ehrman, you need to keep in mind he's not trying to destroy your faith, and what he says shouldn't destroy your faith. But for non-Christians, keep in mind he's not the champion who now has shown that Christianity is wrong and it's dumb. He wouldn't say that about himself. There's no reason that you should say that about him. I wanted to throw in here, I read an article about 15 years ago I think it was in Biblical Review, and they were interviewing 4 different Jesus scholars. One of them was Ehrman, and they were asking the question, how has your academia or how has your studies affected your faith? And Ehrman was the only one who said, like, it completely destroyed it. Like, when you are a Christian, according to Ehrman, you have certain historical things that you have to believe in order to be in this group called Christianity, and I just found that I couldn't believe those things anymore. The other 3, however, and they were from more mainline denominations, like a Methodist or Episcopalian or something like that, or Church of Disciples of Christ, or anyway, that they would say, yeah, all the things that like the Bible's not inerrant, and all these things may not have historically happened, but digging into this has really increased my faith or helped me believe. All right, that's my first thing. My second is probably the most important thing to keep in mind, and that is that Bart Ehrman is a historian. He's been very outspoken about it. There's not much more he can do to just let people know, I am studying history here. Not only has he been outspoken about it, all you have to do is just read a little bit of him. He concentrates on being a good historian, doing what good historians do, approaching things as a historian with historical criteria. He publishes historical works. He's not an agnostic apologist, not an attacker of Christianity. You might see him in a lot of debates on YouTube that make you question that, but these are debates that he has been invited to and paid to do by evangelical Christians trying to prove him wrong. I've heard him say before, a couple of times, that before each and every one of these debates that he does with an evangelical, he always finds himself, right before the debate, scribbling on his notepad a note to himself that says, why am I doing this? And in these debates, if you watch them, you'll notice he's always arguing history. They're always arguing faith. One of the big things is he's just trying to get them to admit they are arguing faith. In fact, in one particularly cringy debate that I watched with Bart Ehrman and James White, White kept pushing Ehrman to debate whether the Bible was the inspired word of God or not, to the point of really being rude and kind of an ass. And Ehrman kept saying, I told you when I accepted the debate, I'll debate you, but I'm not going to talk about your religious belief of inspiration. I'm just going to talk about the text and the history of transmission, like that, all that inspiration stuff. That's you. That you care about all that. I'm going to talk about the text and the history of transmission. Evangelicals write books about Ehrman. They misquote him. They do whatever they can to defeat him. I saw a video recently where Ehrman was going through a book by an evangelical scholar named Gary Habermas, if you've ever heard of him. He's very popular in the evangelical community. He wrote like a 5-volume series on proving the resurrection it was a historical event. And one of the volumes was completely on why Ehrman is wrong. But he kept misquoting Ehrman. And Ehrman said, look, I know Gary. I don't know why he didn't just call me and ask me these things. Okay, that's probably enough, but before I move on, I want to mention this one because I think this is the funniest of them all. And that is Bart's debate with Jimmy Atkin. Atkin paid Ehrman to come debating, but he made Ehrman take the affirmative side. So what I mean, I assume that most people know this, but if you don't, you can't prove a negative. For instance, you can't prove that something doesn't exist. You can only prove that it does exist. So in a debate, the burden of proof, as we call it, is always on the affirmative, someone who wants to prove that something is correct. Well, this means that in Ehrman's debates, when he debates evangelicals, they always have the burden of proof, since they're always the ones trying to say the Bible is inerrant or something like that. And so Bart has the easy side, because all he has to do is point out an inerrancy and boom, debate over. So what Atkin did, he has Bart debate his side as a positive. So Bart has to debate the positive affirmation that the Gospels are not historically accurate. So now Bart is put in a position of proving a negative. And for Atkin's part, all he has to do is say, well, here's something historical, boom, I win, right? So now, I still think that Atkins got taken to school that day, but it was just funny because it's such an obvious attempt to manipulate the debate in such a way that Atkin gets to prove his point. Like, do anything you can to destroy Bart. All right, what I'm getting at here with number 2 is that Bart is an historian. He uses historical criteria. He is interested in doing history. Okay, that being said, so number 3, that being said, I think you need to keep in mind when reading Bart that all historians, like all the rest of us, have their biases. Like, there's no doubt about that. We always bring our past experiences to everything we do and think. All good historians realize this. Many try to overcome it, and they'll start off their books by telling us all the ways that they've tried to overcome their biases, and some embrace it. Some just say, we have to look at history from a certain perspective, and here's my perspective. It can't be overlooked in this context that Ehrman used to be an evangelical Christian, and after learning more about history, he moved away into being a liberal Christian, and then eventually he moved into being an atheist. Like many who rebel against the way that they're raised, Ehrman holds a grudge against his past. So, no matter how objective he tries to be, I don't think it's hard to imagine that because of this bias, when he's faced with two equally historically plausible things, he's going to go with the one that's most against evangelical Christianity. Now, I can't prove that, and so I'm not going to make a big deal about it. I'm just going to say it's something that I personally keep in the back of my mind. Like, oh, really? Bart thinks that Jesus wasn't talking about himself when he was talking about the Son of Man. Or, oh, he doesn't see the we passages in Acts as being historically reliable. Like, surprise, surprise. I'm not saying that I disagree with him on those things. In fact, most of the time I do agree with him. I'm just saying that I personally try to keep it in mind that he does have access to grind, and he's not the only game in town, to use a couple of metaphors. By the way, you need to do the same thing when reading Christian historians. I didn't know whether to make this point number 5 or not, or just put it right here, so I'm just going to put it here. Historians are trained in history. Historians that make historical arguments, they're worth listening to, they're worth debating, but they all have biases. A Christian historian is not necessarily wrong just because he or she is a Christian, and Ehrman is not necessarily right because he's not, or vice versa. Bart certainly has a lot of respect for people like Dale Allison, Dom Crossan, Raymond Brown. He talks about these scholars an awful lot. Sometimes he agrees with them, sometimes he doesn't, but on history, not on religion. So you need to always remember that there are biases there, and just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are right or wrong. It's just something that I personally find it helpful to remember. In fact, I personally think that Ehrman would respect evangelical scholars more if they would just admit their own biases. Like if they would come to the table and say, this is the inspired, holy word of God, it can't be wrong, and that's how I start. Okay, now we know those are the parameters of the debate. Anyway, so my fourth thing to remember when reading, or keep in mind when reading Ehrman, is to know that when you are reading a scholarly book and when you are reading a trade book. Ehrman is a scholar first and foremost. He writes very good scholarly works. By the way, I summarized one of those, one of his first works on my channel. It's called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. It really changed the way that we look at textual criticism and how that is done. But that was a scholarly book. Most of his books he writes are trade books. Trade books are not written for a scholarly community. They're written for a general audience. And there's very good and bad things about writing a trade book. The good part is that it really allows him to fly through a lot of material. For instance, in the book that I'm reading right now, like he goes from beliefs about God in the ancient world to the historical Jesus, to the reliability of the Gospels, to the Trinity, and like all of this is in this little bitty book. He can sort of assume that what he's saying is correct, and then he can briefly explain it, and he can move to his next conclusion. He can avoid a lot of nuances that you'll find in scholarly literature. Now, again, I'm not saying that he's wrong on any of this stuff. I'm just saying that he doesn't have to address every little thing, because scholars will go on and on for pages and pages about the slightest things, making sure to cover all the existent literature and to show how their interpretation is correct. With a trade book, you don't have to do that. You can explain a logical or historical argument in a matter of pages that might have taken centuries for scholars to develop. Now, that is a positive. The negative is that after reading Ehrman, you might be inclined to believe that you know it all now, right? Or that obviously he's right about these things without having to actually go and investigate other avenues or even knowing that other avenues are out there. But in almost everything he says, he is engaged in a debate that has been raging for a long time, not just with evangelicals, but with actual historians. All right, so there you have it. That, at least for me, is the four things that I try to remember, keep in the back of my head as I'm trying to read Ehrman. If I've missed something, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, make sure you like the video before you go. And if you like content like this, subscribe to my channel.